My name is Dipak Patel. In my day job, I'm a senior advisor to the Presidential Climate Commission, which is chaired by President Ramaphosa, and I advise on matters related to climate finance, as well as other innovative approaches to try and get us successfully to meet our development needs, while at the same time keeping an eye on climate change and how we should be responding to it.
At the last edition of Africa's Green Economy Summit, we heard that climate mitigating projects on the continent only get about 18% of private sector funding. Now in South Africa that figure is maybe the inverse. What do you think can be done, and what is South Africa maybe doing to up that level of involvement by the private sector?
So South Africa is a standout economy compared to the rest of the continent when it comes to this matter. So I do want to say that when we study climate finance flows, which we've done quite comprehensively over the last 3 or 4 years, what we're seeing for our South African relief is that the bulk of the climate finance is flowing as a result of domestic flows, the bulk of which domestic flows are coming largely from the private sector, both investors as well as financial institutions, which then leads me to ask the question, what is the difference between South Africa and the rest of the continent? And the unfortunate reality is that in order to mobilize domestic capital, particularly domestic private capital, one needs a degree of depth and maturity of domestic capital and financial markets. And I would say that there is no one-size-fits-all, firstly, but that secondly, it is imperative for those countries that do have some degree of savings and some degree of domestic private sector to find creative ways of, for want of a better word, exercising that private capital. How does one exercise private capital? Where corporate sector strength does exist, there are creative ways of attracting the corporate balance sheets to invest in a particular way. Where a country is abjectly poor, unfortunately, there is going to be a greater and greater reliance on external flows, not just private flows, but in fact probably more dependence on concessional flows and grants. And in those cases, I think what is very necessary to do is articulate a clear strategy, because without a strategic articulation against which a policy assessment can be made about a domestic government's seriousness, there is no one who is going to come riding like a knight in shining armor to the rescue. So that's the first point. There has to be strategic intent followed by policy seriousness. In the case of very low income countries, there we are faced with the challenge of energy access and energy security before we can talk about mitigation, because of how little they emit anyway and the criticality of energy for their development pathway. So those countries could very convincingly make an argument that for their development and for them to leapfrog into renewable sector for their development could be a compelling reason why there should be funding, firstly from international donors, but secondly from international private capital to be able to fund some of those projects. But I do want to say that domestic seriousness and display of that intention is critical.
What is your view of the opportunities that voluntary carbon markets can bring for climate finance? on the continent.
So when you told me you were going to ask me about voluntary or otherwise carbon markets, I shuddered because I am yet to find someone who can explain to an ignoramus like myself what this carbon market thing is. But I found a really nice segue from the last point that I made, and that is in low-income countries where the development index is extremely low but development needs are high, there is generally, not always, but generally, a correlation between the pathways to that development that are renewable or climate friendly versus energy intensive and therefore emitting. And in these cases, there needs to be a clear and predictable way in which the carbon that would have been emitted is regarded to have been saved. And to put it quite simply, if there is a mechanism through which this can be certified, then those countries can make a case that they have carbon credits to offer as part of the financing package.